Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to Vitalpoint Church. My name is Ron. I'm the lead pastor here. And as already been mentioned, and I want to just say thank you so much for being part of this gathering today. And if you are someone who has responded to the invitation of being here today, I want to say way to go, way to be courageous and get out of bed and be here. It's such an amazing thing. I appreciate that so much. One of the values that we have as a church is inviting others. And we hear this all the time around Vital Point Church. It was one invitation or two invitations and the response, and someone would say, hey, I responded and it changed my life. And so for those of you who are actually giving the invites to those in your life, I want to say way to go. The courage to send the text, to share the social media posts, or even do the courageous face-to-face, hey, would you come with me to church? I also want to say welcome to all those of you who continue to be part of Vital Point Church on a regular basis. It's an amazing place because of you. And so I'm appreciative of that. Okay, so we're in a series, as been mentioned, Exodus and Jesus, or Exodus to Jesus, however you want to look at the series. And I want to start today's conversation by asking two questions. Now, don't answer them out loud. Just ponder the question, okay? That's what I want you to do with me. So the first question is this: how do you talk about God? Like if someone were to come up to you at work tomorrow and they were to ask you to describe God, how would you do it? Well, some of us would say, well, I see God as a father figure, and you identify the qualities of the father figure that you see in God. You would describe him like that. Others of you might say he's distant. He's only intervenes in my life when I ask him to. Or others of us treat God like he's a genie in the bottle. Like, you know, those people that pray for a parking spot when they go to the mall at Christmas, and there's a spot there, and they kind of go, whoa, God answered my prayer, or made all the lights green. You know, I know not all of us go to the mall anymore. You normally have that white van that pulls up in front of your house. I get it, but you know what I'm talking about, right? We treat God or talk about God or describe God like he's the genie in the bottle, right? All right, second question. What has shaped your understanding of God? It's a bit different, right? Because we all have experiences with God at some form and some shape. And the experiences have shaped our understanding of who God is. Like, talk to someone who's experienced deep loss of a loved one, a parent, a child, a sibling, a really good friend, right? Sometimes that defines our understanding of God. Look at the world around us, and that can define our understanding of God. We see death and war and abuse and human trafficking, and we see all of these things, and it defines our understanding of God. This last year, I've spent an enormous amount of time asking myself questions just like this. How do I talk about God? What is my experiences in life that has shaped my understanding of God? You see, I have the privilege and the honor to be able to stand almost every week in front of a camera or on a stage and interact and talk about God and interact with people in my everyday life. And I talk about God, and I have to ask myself the simple question is, when I talk about God or my understanding of God, am I describing him in the right way? This past year, I've asked an even deeper question. What if God doesn't exist? What if God doesn't exist? What if we have come up with this story of God out of our emotion and we've been unknowingly duped? Now, don't panic. I've not deconstructed my faith. I do believe in God. But I think it's important to step back every once in a while and ask the tougher questions about who God is and how we describe God and our understanding of God and what has shaped our view of God, because if we don't, we end up with a boring, unhealthy view of who he is. I wonder, even for those of us who are listening to this message right now or watching this message that are in the exploring stage of the things of faith, sometimes our understanding and view of God limits our ability to surrender our lives fully to Jesus because we have a false view of God. You know, the truth is that we try to talk about God. We try to define God and how we experience God. And the truth is that we find and discover things about him, and then all of a sudden there's other aspects of who he is. And we try to maybe define him by putting him in a box, and then all of a sudden we realize that he doesn't fit in that box anymore. And we just need to step back and examine and ask the tougher questions, even if it presents a hard perspective on God, as we are about to see. See, this series, Exodus to Jesus, is describing this epic moment of God's people in slavery for hundreds of years and how God was going to raise up a leader and to lead them out of slavery. It's been found in the book of Exodus. And we've been exploring this for weeks on end. And we realize that even as we read the story, this epic story, that God's people themselves in slavery for hundreds of years have their perspective on God. Where are you? Have you forgotten us? You're not good on your promises, right? What we must understand is that this story, found in the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, is a story that reveals the depth of who God is. It's one of the most epic stories of understanding the complexity and the wonder and the awe of God outside of the cross of Jesus Christ. Because this story is really about God revealing himself to his people, revealing himself to the people of Egypt. And my hope is that we will have our understanding reshaped, because here's why. The temptation will be when we hear, especially today, as we look at some very, very difficult, complex passages in the story, is that we will take our understanding, our experience, and we'll place it over the biblical stories and try to come up with an understanding of God that simply may not be true. See, oftentimes we're even unaware of how our worldview shapes these stories and creates a fuzzy view of God. For example, if you fully believe that God is love, and God is love, that is absolutely true. But if you allow the definition of love from the world's perspective to be in that phrase, God is love, then you're going to read and see this story in just a few moments, and you're going to say, how can a loving God bring death and destruction? And for many of us, because we have this false view of love, we're going to run from God and think, I can't follow a God like that. Why would I want that kind of God in my life? But really, we need to step back and realize that God is holy, which means this, that he's perfectly just and full of mercy. That's what I want us to see today about God. From the story we're going to look at, I want you to think about these two words, justice and mercy, and how these two fit together within the grander story of Exodus. The section that was read for us just a few moments ago is the story where Moses finally goes back to Egypt to deliver God's people from slavery. If you remember last week, Moses has argued with God. He's like, God, are you sure? I can't go back. I'm not the one. I can't do this. But he finally gets to the place where he goes and back into Egypt, and he collects the elders of God's people, and he tells them that God has seen their pain, heard their cry, and God is going to deliver them from slavery. But here's the crazy part about it, is that Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, the king of Egypt, goes, I have no idea who this Yahweh character is. And he refuses to let God's people go. And so there's this crazy showdown between Moses and Pharaoh. And we see God do something that may cause us to bristle a little bit, kind of go, ooh, is God like this? Because in the story, we discover that God sends 10 plagues over Egypt. The extent of these plagues is found in Exodus chapter 7, verse 12. And we begin to see that God strikes Pharaoh and Egypt with these 10 plagues. And in this, we begin to allow ourselves to have our understanding of God reshaped. Let's jump in. The first thing that I want us to notice when it comes to our reading today, actually, is that God knew that Pharaoh was not going to respond favorably to Moses' request to let his people go. This is just up front. Exodus 3:19, but I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by our mighty hand. God is letting Moses know that this isn't going to be easy. And what we see in this moment is the foreknowledge of God on full display, which means this: nothing catches God off guard. The reality of the situation, the situation that God's people have found themselves, the burden that Pharaoh has placed on God's people, God reveals it to them that he understands what is about to happen because of his foreknowledge. Small application for us would be this: when life gets hard, God is fully aware. When life gets hard, God is fully aware. Now, it might beg the question to say, well, if God is fully aware, then why doesn't he stop these things from happening in our lives? Well, we could follow it up with, well, do you want a God that's pulling the strings like a puppet master behind the curtain of our lives? Or do we want the ability to have free will? You can't have both. So the struggle would be, if he's a puppet master behind the strings, pulling the strings, then we go, I'm frustrated with God because I can't make my own choices, or you want your own choices. The complexity of this, you can't have both, right? See, God's foreknowledge reveals that Pharaoh will not let his people go, which takes us to the place where he realizes that, and he reveals it to Moses, that it will take a mighty hand in the release of God's people. This is really fascinating. Let me geek out with you for just a few minutes. In chapter 4 of Exodus, God reveals his mighty hand to Moses in this moment. He actually speaks to Moses, and Moses has got this staff in his hand. And God says, Moses, I want you to throw your staff on the ground. Okay? Stay with me on this. So Moses throws the staff down, and the staff turns into a snake. And it says that Moses was afraid. I get it. Most of us are afraid of snakes, except for a few strange people that have snakes as pets. I have no idea why you do. There's something wrong with you, but you're welcome at church, just so we're clear. Okay? So he's afraid. And then what does God say to Moses? He says, Moses, I want you to pick it up. Look at verse 4 of chapter 4. But the Lord says to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. Now he wants him to pick it up. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. For some of us who are a little bit more familiar with the Bible, some of us are not all familiar with it, but some of us are. Where else have we seen the form of a snake? Where else? If your mind is going to Genesis in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, you're exactly right. See, remember, the Bible is always revealing things to us. The snake trick that God pulled off was not to impress Moses. God doesn't need to impress us. God is purposely revealing something for Moses, and it is this, that God has all authority over evil and that he will banish it. We actually see this in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where God has this conversation with the serpent. Look at this. It says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. In this one verse, we realize that evil is now present. There's going to be conflict in our world. There's going to be sin in our world. There's going to be tension between the two offsprings. It's why we have evil and abuse and conflict and war and famine and mosquitoes, right? The results is because of Adam and Eve's sin. But in this verse, we also see the wonder and the beauty of God's good news, that he's revealing that the one he will send, which will be his own son, will come to ultimately conquer sin and death. He'll crush the head of the serpent. This is God's justice and mercy emerging to deal with evil and directing us to the wonder of who he is. Now, Moses might be afraid of the snake, but God is showing Moses that what his hand will be like in delivering his people, and it will be revealed to Pharaoh through the things in which he will do. See, when we think about evil in this world, we get lost often in the questions of why doesn't God do something about it? And the reality is that God does do something about it, that God is in the midst of it. When we see things like famine and child slavery and human trafficking and war and so on and so forth, and we go, well, where is God? Well, actually, God is right in the middle of it, bringing peace and hope to those who desire his comfort. And actually, his church is even in the midst of it too. You know, sometimes we act like, well, why doesn't God do anything about it? Like we care more than God does. If that be the case, then why aren't we doing something about it, right? So when Moses now is this interaction with God, he's revealing his victory. He's revealing what's going to happen in this moment. He helps Moses understand that, yes, there will be opposition, that, yes, Pharaoh will stand in his way, but the victory is his and will be his because of the staff and the snake moment. This might be a bit too soon to point to Jesus because typically we wait to the end of the message, but I feel like I should do it now before you phase out too much. We must know and understand that the victory that God brings to us is through the person of Jesus Christ. Because why? Because Jesus went to the cross, he went to the tomb, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead, defeating death and sin. And the Bible reassures us of the evil that God has taken care of, that evil will not get the last word, but God does. All right, so back to the story. I've bunny trailed around it. So back to the story now, because some of you are wondering, what's up with the 10 plagues, right? So chapters 7 to 12, we see justice and mercy on display in the 10. Let me give you the 10. Chapter 7 through 12 is lengthy, so I'm not going to read it for you. We'd be here till, dinner time. So let me just list them for you, okay? So the 10 strikes of God on Pharaoh and Egypt are this. The Nile River turns to blood. There's frogs that cover the land, even goes in their beds. It's kind of creepy. There's gnats that rise up in the dust. There's flies that ruin the land. There's livestock that die. Boils cover the bodies of both humans and animals. There's hail sent from heaven so large it kills everything that it hits. There's locusts that cover the land so that you can't even see the ground anymore. Can you imagine that? And then there's darkness covered the land for 3 days. And then number 10, firstborn son dies in the land of Egypt. Aren't you glad you came to church today? You're thinking to yourself, what in the world is all this? Remember, the story is to reshape our understanding of God through justice and mercy. See, all 10, we must hear this. If you get nothing else from this, I want you to hear this. Out of all 10 strikes, Pharaoh has an opportunity to respond to God's mercy to let his people go. Each one of these acts of justice over every one of these strikes is a revealing of God's justice and God's mercy. And what you begin to see, though, in the story, if you read it for yourself later today, is that you see that even some of Pharaoh's magicians, in the midst of what God was doing, they go to Pharaoh and they say, truly, this is the hand of the one true God. Pharaoh says, I don't know who this Yahweh character is. His magicians are going, Pharaoh, we better pay attention here. We witness and see the mighty hand of God. Now, what's interesting about this is that the first 6, see, we see the plagues and we also see Pharaoh's heart in all this. The first 6 plagues, it describes Pharaoh's heart as hard. Okay, so now he's resistant to the opportunities to respond to God and to let his people go. And so in this, in the first 6 in particular, you see there is a passive approach to the hardening of the heart, and there is an active. So it would say his heart was hard. It just describes it. It's in the passive sense. But then it says that he hardened his heart. This is the active will of the Pharaoh. Now keep in mind, remember, Pharaoh is a tyrant. He is evil. He's inflicted suffering at mass. He's enslaved people. He's killed the firstborn male child of God's people right in front of their families, throwing them into the Nile River. I mean, even think about that for just a second. I mean, think about the first plague that God sends is what? That the Nile River turns into blood. What is God saying to Pharaoh in this moment? I have seen what you've done. Don't think that I didn't notice. Don't think that I'm just going to turn a blind eye to this. Don't just think for a moment that you're going to kill children that are created in my image and get away with it. See, what we have in this moment is God's justice and mercy being expressed in taking care of the evil. I mean, think about the people of Israel. Think about, they're defined as the Hebrews as well. Think about them for a moment. Their understanding of God for 400 years, they've been enslaved by Egypt, burden that they carried. I mean, we can't even fathom what they had to do in the labor in which was inflicted upon them. They're thinking God has abandoned them. He's forgotten them, right? I mean, they've seen and experienced all these things. Put yourself in their sandals for just a second in the moment when God is bringing strikes against Pharaoh in Egypt, especially in these first 6 understanding of what's happening, is that they're now beginning to understand, oh, God is just. And in the midst of it, what is even crazier is that their livestock, their families, their people are protected in the midst of it. So they're experiencing the fullness of the mercy of God, right? Now, you must ask yourself, which we're all probably asking, like, how could a loving God do this? It's a fair question. It's a fair understanding. It's a fair question to ask ourselves. And we must find this place to ask these questions. And we see this because Pharaoh refuses to submit to God, surrender his life to the will of what God wanted him to do. here's another piece of this that I was thinking about this a little bit. Like, in all the questions that we have about God, especially in this story, is that I want to follow a God who is just. I want to follow a God who will take care of evil and wickedness in this world. I mean, don't you? I mean, think about justice in your own life. Yeah, recently, I went to a hockey game. A family in our church. I jumped in the car with them. We drove to Hamilton, and I watched this hockey game. And you want to see justice on display. You see it in a rink, right? You see a penalty committed against one of the team members of the team that I was watching, and it gets missed, right? And all of a sudden, parents are yelling. That was a penalty. That was a trip. That was a slash. You could even pick out what parent owns the kid that the penalty was given against, because it's their kid, and they scream for justice. And in particular, some hockey games, it wasn't this one, people start chanting, ref, you suck, right? So there's this element of justice. Why? Because God is a God of justice. See, we can't have justice without mercy any more than we can have joy without sorrow. Now, I teased you a little bit with the story in Pharaoh's heart, and I think we need to go back to it. I want to go back to this because you're going to later today go home and read this, and there's going to be some confusing parts about this. And I was dropping little breadcrumbs for you just a moment ago about Pharaoh's heart and the first six of the strikes of God and the plagues. And I want to take you that because some of you are going to read it later and you can be like, oh, Ron, I don't know what this means. So let me try to help you with this, okay? So Pharaoh's heart is hard. Passive and active, we talked about this. But then, this is crazy. Then after the sixth plague, it's described to us that God actually hardens Pharaoh's heart. Look at Exodus 9:12. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had spoken to Moses. So we got the foreknowledge of God saying Pharaoh's not going to let my people go. I get it. It's going to take the mighty hand of God. It's going to be this crazy experience. But then what? Wait, God's hardening Pharaoh's heart? Does that mean that Pharaoh had no say in this? Let me help you this, because we see this in, actually, I got to say this verse, for Exodus 4:20b. It says, but I will harden his heart, and that he won't let my people go. So the confusion is here. Here's what I want you to understand. And Tyler Stanton from Bridgetown helped me on this. God steps in and hardens the heart of Pharaoh after the sixth strike. The attention of the first six was given to Pharaoh in order for him to turn from his ways and experience the mercy of God. After the sixth one, we see the seventh one, which is the number of perfection. We begin to see God now focusing on the opportunity for the people of Egypt to now respond to the mercy of God. So the justice and mercy are on display, which Pharaoh refuses to respond to. And now he's turning it more towards the people of Egypt and giving them an opportunity to respond to his mercy and his goodness. And so in essence, what God does is he takes over the situation that was already happening in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart that he was doing himself. God took this over, and he now took action with this. And we discover that even some of the people that in Egypt that turned to God joined God's people. And eventually, you can read it later, they leave Egypt and they head towards the promised land with the Red Sea, which we'll get to eventually, is that the people of God end up caring for the very ones that put the burden on them, which speaks and screams loudly to how Jesus taught on how we should treat our enemies. So this is this beautiful thing that begins to emerge. What are some of the applications? Well, first big application would be this. And I love this quote from Tyler Stanton. It says this: even in the most horrendous human evil, God is actively working towards a redemptive purpose. I'm going to say it again. Hopefully we'll leave it on the screen for you. Even in the most horrendous human evil, God is actively working towards a redemptive purpose. When we see the human condition and the horrifying things in our world, we must understand, we can't take a posture that God doesn't care, because he does. And that he's trying to bring about his purposes. He's trying to bring about comfort. He's trying to bring about healing. He's trying to bring about the things that lift the sorrows of those who are feeling the burden. Even when we watch conflict and war in our world, You can't assume that God doesn't care, because he does. He cares deeply. Even more so, I would say this. Let's put it in personal. Let's think about our own pain, our own grief, our own sorrow, and our own hurt. It is the mercy of God that brings about the opportunities to step into the moments where God wants to redefine this pain. He wants to bring greater things out of it so that he can refine us into the people that he wants us to be. What struck me about Pharaoh is he didn't take responsibility. Think about the choices we make in life. Think about the choices that we make that bring pain into our lives. What is God actually doing to try to get our attention so that we will take responsibility and to turn to him and to experience the fullness of his mercy and his grace? But we have to take it a step farther. We have to go a step farther in this, and we have to look at Jesus in the midst of all of this. And this comes in the last plague. The first one was the Nile River turning to blood. The last one is the firstborn of each home would be killed by the angel of death. This is where the Passover comes from. And we're going to talk about this more in depth next week as we unpack the story. But the Passover in this last plague is the foreshadow of Jesus, who would ultimately become the sacrifice for our sin. The Passover would be this expression that God required of people to sacrifice a lamb and take the blood and put it on the doorpost. And when the death angel would come, it would pass over that home. And the people of God would celebrate the Passover and remember the beauty and the wonder of God's mercy and God's justice on display. And what is so incredible about this is that Jesus takes this moment when he's with his disciples on the night that he's betrayed, and he actually repurposes it in a way to fulfill the greater picture of what God had done in Exodus that would be fulfilled within his own life and death and resurrection. See, the Exodus story is always pointing us to Jesus. The Passover would be celebration that would be repurposed, that we could understand the greatest display of God's justice and mercy for all of humanity, for all of the sin, as displayed at the cross. See, sin can't go unchecked. It has to be dealt with. And what's so beautiful about the message of the Christian faith and the message of Jesus and the power of what God does is that he doesn't say, I hope you figure it out. What he says is, I will step in. I will come to you. I will come to you in the form of a baby. I will grow up and I will go to a cross, and I will be and God says, my son will be the perfect Lamb of God. This is the greatest description of God's justice and mercy coming together in this one. I want to read this verse for you. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 and 6. These few verses. It says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Did you catch that? Not just any ordinary mercy. It's not like when you got pinned down and made to say uncle. It's this rich mercy that he pours out to us from his great love, which he loved us. And that he, in the midst of our trespasses, in the midst of our sin, he makes us alive in Christ. The justice and the mercy is displayed so we can experience it through the person of Jesus Christ, and that we're seated in heavenly places. This is the beauty and the wonder of being, having our understanding and our experience of God reshaped and renewed. So my question is this. If someone were to stop you tomorrow at work and ask you to describe God, how would you describe him? How have you experienced God? Like, have you experienced the wonder and the mercy and the grace of God? I talk to people all the time about this, and I keep saying to them, God has been trying to get your attention. Will you just surrender? I think sometimes what we do is we use the excuses of our understanding of God, our preconceived ideas of God, and we really, truly miss the wonder and the awe of who he is. That he's always trying to show us his grace and his mercy. That's saturated in his love for us. Yes, God is love, but he's also holy. And I'm so thankful that through the person of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of coming out of that tomb, he's conquered sin and death so that we might have life. Will you today put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ? today, will you be able to describe to someone at work that he is the one who showed you mercy and grace and who loves you deeply?